everybody. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on this Tuesday evening as we continue through fall camp. Georgia's now in their third week of fall camp as the preparations continue. I believe we're about 18 days away from that game against Clemson in Atlanta. A lot to get into from what we heard from Kirby Smart, Oscar Delp, and Jalen Walker on Tuesday. Looking back at that first scrimmage that was held Saturday, check in a little bit on what we've learned to this point. We're getting close to that halfway point of fall camp. Go through what has stood out to us, what we've learned to this point. Talk a little recruiting, talk a little Stetson Bennett, and then talk a little bit about the Dawgs who made the trip to Paris for the Summer Olympics. So let's get into what we learned on Tuesday. We had a chance to talk to Kirby Smart. A lot of interesting stuff, which you could imagine coming out of the first scrimmage of fall camp. Don't think this was necessarily a surprise, but Kirby wasn't exactly thrilled with the first performance. Talked a lot about lack of enthusiasm, lack of energy, which I can imagine, going through that first scrimmage. It's hot, it's trying to get your bearings, especially if you're a younger guy. But I wanted to play a clip of Kirby just sort of talking briefly on what has stood out to him and the work that Georgia still has to do at this point in fall camp.
We are nowhere near where we're close to where we need to be. I feel like we have less depth than we've ever had, and that's kind of a common theme talking to other coaches I talk to. I call it the deterioration of football because every year we've been here, I feel like we've had more players capable of going in and play winning football, and every year that goes down. So we've got to keep working to increase that number.
And guys, before we kind of talk about some other stuff Kirby said, I thought that was really interesting, him talking about the deterioration of football. And he was asked a little bit later, was the transfer portal a piece of this? And he kind of thought he thought it was no more so on the high school level, less people playing, high school programs not able to necessarily run guys as much and practice like they needed to develop these guys. I'll start with you, Ben. Did you have any thoughts on that piece of the puzzle that Kirby was kind of talking about, the deterioration of football? I saw people in the junkyard talking about this a little bit, if they thought that Kirby was on to something with this.
Well, the deterioration of football by Kirby Smart would be number one on my next to read list if he wanted to get to work on writing that book. I would love to learn a little bit more about what that means to him, because it sounds like it's not the first time that he's thought about that. And it sounds like it's something that obviously he's very passionate about. And I think roster management wise, you're not going to find anybody who's better. You're not going to find anybody who assesses his situation and the situation of others better than Kirby Smart does with rosters. And I think depth was the theme of the press conference today. Depth, I feel like, has been sort of the theme of the offseason or just the fall camp press conferences in general. He's talked about it at a few different position groups. He's talked about it on interior defensive line. He's talked about it in the secondary. It's come up at times just with some other injuries and other places. Obviously with Ra Thomas's dismissal, it came up at the wide receiver position at the very beginning of camp. And so it's interesting. And, I know that and I don't know if you're going to show this clip or not, but I know he joked around a little bit about where there was depth and where there wasn't depth and what he was willing to share versus what he wasn't willing to share. And so he didn't go into many details about it, but there's certainly some areas that he's very hopeful take some strides over the next 2 weeks, because it really is crazy when you look up and realize, all right, fall camp's wrapping up, classes are getting started. By this time next week, Georgia is going to be all the way into Clemson prep mode. And so, it's coming up on it pretty quick.
Kip, did you have any thoughts just on the deterioration of football that Kirby kind of threw out there? Do you think there's something to what Kirby was talking about?
I'm sure there's layers to, if we start getting into just what year-round practice 7-on-7 does, and then the other sports, safety, everything. The roster changes that'll come next year. There's a lot of depth to what he said, but I think it's also just year 9 of Kirby hitting the panic button after the first scrimmage. I mean, if we want to talk about the theme this offseason and creating adversity, I think he's just trying to do it himself. He's experiencing himself after you guys mentioned the scrimmage on Saturday. I mean, from all we've heard, they were barely able to get through this because the heat index was over 100 still. It was 102, 103 out there. They are running out of fluids real quick out there. It's tough to do anything. It's tough to mow your lawn in that weather and that heat, much less try to burn the amount of calories they do. I mean, we got guys out there losing double-digit pounds in the matter of a couple of hours, which sounds like a dream to me. But for these guys, I'm sure, it wasn't enjoyable for them. And you have to do that right now, because if you just look at Georgia's schedule, they're playing indoors to start the season. And then, you have Tennessee Tech. Then you have night games on the road. So, until Auburn in October, you're not really middle of the day. You don't know if you're going to be tested with the heat being a factor. So you have to create those conditions. And that's exactly what Kirby's trying to do, because you have to build that stamina up on your roster. And I don't think that even if Kirby was given 105 scholarships right now, I don't think he'd be happy with his depth on the team right now. I mean, he is always talking to his players, and he's always going to say, we're not where we need to be, which, I mean, that was the one quote you could lock in that he was going to give today, and he did. So while, yes, they're dealing with different challenges in the sport and trying to, combine safety with the sport that we still all know and love, I think overall today was much ado about nothing.
You talked about the heat, Kip. Did you get caught in it with any kind of moving, anything like that with your son?
Yeah, middle of the day. He told me what time he was moving, 3:30, and I was like, great. This is going to be a nightmare, and it was. But congratulations to all the other families that were able to move their kids in this past weekend. I know school starts on Wednesday for most of them. Yeah, that was my little training camp hour of hell out there. And you know what? Year two of moving in down, only a couple to go. But yes, that was my fall camp adversity, and I barely made it through.
I don't know about a couple. I don't know if Ben did. I don't know if you got through college in 4 years, but I think Kip might be selling his son short a little bit if he's saying only 2 more.
Yeah, correct.
Those summer online classes are going to come in handy. He's gonna stack those credits however he can. We're going to push him through with whatever degree we can get him.
Looking back at some of the other stuff Kirby talked about, I want to make sure I mention some of the injury updates. Center Jared Wilson, Kirby said dealing with an Achilles tendonitis, but added he's done well, continuing to ramp back up. Chaz Chambliss, soft tissue hamstring injury. Roderick Robinson, I noticed someone on the Junkyard had mentioned he had been in a boot. Dealing with a bit of a toe injury, does not sound serious. Jordan Hall, probably the biggest one, had already been dealing with a stress fracture in the tibia in one of his legs, and then sustained the same injury in the other leg. So that sort of, has put him back, but it sounds like long-term, that's not something that Georgia's concerned with. I don't know if he'll be back for Clemson. That seems doubtful, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be something that lingers very far into the season. Ben mentioned definitely the funniest moment on Tuesday. Shout out Athens Banner Herald's Mark Weiser. He asked Kirby about the depth and basically said, is there an area or areas that you guys are most concerned about with the depth? And Kirby said yes. And that's all he said. So Mark followed up and said, will you tell us which area that is? And Kirby said no. So that was pretty much open and shut there. But I think there's some, though, that are very obvious. I think defensive line is very clearly got to be one of those that they think about. Ben, any thoughts on how Kirby handled that? I know that piqued your interest from what was said.
Well, I just think we should speculate. I think now the door's left open for speculation. I'm curious to know what you guys, where you all think. If you were to say right now at this point, 2.5 weeks until Clemson, where Georgia has the least depth or where your biggest areas of concern would be from a depth standpoint, what would it be?
I mean, I say defensive line for sure. And there's a few other positions, but I kind of feel like it's receiver because you've got the guys that we know, Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell, and, you feel good about Colby Young, but I think he was kind of beat up. I don't think that he went full go in that scrimmage. So, a position that I think they still have talent, but just having experience, I'd throw a receiver out there. Kip, what do you think?
It's got to be center, right? No starts, no career starts at center. No one. I mean, you got Tate Ratledge practicing out there. You're expecting Jared Wilson to be ready for the season over, but what about reps? He needs to be out there and getting as many as he can, full activity out there, or else you're going to have to shuffle the deck a little bit. And I mean, I do know that Stacey Searles has a position room that any coach in the country would love to have, but we're talking about the center position. And if I'm going further than that, I would say you don't want this to impact your season at all, but I still have huge question marks as far as maybe not the depth of the position, but backup quarterback. I just think that is an area where I still, I don't know many programs who'd really know what they have in their backup quarterback, but it's still like a huge question mark for me. And honestly, I think, again, I think Georgia recruits that position differently than a lot of programs do these days. And they get guys who can kind of stay in the pocket, make plays there where, they can run if they need to. But the fact that Georgia focuses on pass protection in the pocket, I do think that helps them as far as avoiding injuries for the most part. And honestly, with the added games, I just think that's an interesting aspect to how you recruit the quarterback position, because you see it all the time with injuries where, quarterbacks who have the ability to run, who tend to run as often as they pass, they get banged up, they take hits, and you end up having to go to your backup quarterback more often than not. And so I just think that's an intriguing aspect of quarterback recruiting moving forward, but also just for me, I'm just looking at this group and I'm wondering, who do we know for sure that Gunnar Stockton is, taking that next step as a quarterback, just like Carson Beck did in the previous years? Is he ready? Because if they need him to step up, he's got to be ready to run this offense pretty similarly to the way Carson Beck does.
Ben, what about you? What positions would you speculate?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would, to me, if I were just putting my Kirby Smart hat on, I feel like he's paranoid about defensive backs. I feel like if you look at the star position and what has been lost year over year with Javon Bullard and Tyke Smith really doing a great job there over the last 2 seasons, really. And then, I think Janelle, no matter who it is that's really honing down that spot, and I don't know who you all would put as the front runner right there to be getting the most reps come the season. But you look at a guy like Janelle Aguero, he's young. You look at a guy like Ja'Cory Thomas, he hasn't played a lot, even though he's maybe been around the program a little bit. You look at some of the guys that they've brought in, whether that be freshmen or transfers, there's just not a lot of in Athens reps at the star position. And so I think, from what I was told from the Classic City Collective practice that happened, he was really hounding that position group and he was getting after Travaris Robinson specifically. So I think that there is a call to action at that position group specifically. Whether that's who he was thinking of when Mark asked him about the specific position groups with depth, I don't really know. But that's definitely one where I'm intrigued to see what that position group looks like by week 1.
I asked Kirby just about the DBs as a whole in that first scrimmage, and the start of his response was essentially a long way to go. And so we'll see how those guys answer that. A couple other clips I grabbed from Kirby. Thought this was interesting, him talking about Carson Beck. I believe the question was sort of about Carson being assertive and trying to get everybody on the same page and sort of leading the way on offense. And Kirby sort of talked about the fact that they've got some proven guys back, but there's a lot of new faces and, trying to keep Carson from pressing too much. I thought this was really interesting. Let's have a listen.
Depth around Carson at the skill positions that there's been in the past. And, it puts more pressure on him to probably feel like he's got to be perfect, to feel like he's got to make the right decision, the protection check, do this. And can I count on that guy that hadn't done it yet to do the right thing and trust that he's going to do it even though he may be a freshman? Those are things that Carson's, he's got to get familiar with those other guys. And that's the hardest part in the depth is, we count on our quarterback to put us in the right play or make the right decision on so many plays. And Carson does a great job of that. And I think he's had a very detailed, attentive camp. Assertive is not something that he is. He's just not naturally going to go out there and just be assertive vocally. He's assertive in his checks, and he's assertive in his decision making. That's certainly much more important than just what he says to the group as a whole.
Yeah, one he goes back to the depth there, which maybe that had a piece of why I thought about wide receiver. But also just looking at Kirby talking about that with Carson. I think that there's been a lot made about what Carson's going to do to take the step forward, or how is he going to go and grow from the 2023 season. But I don't know if you felt this way, Ben, but I feel like I haven't heard a ton about Carson during fall camp. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. He's a guy that is very clearly established as the quarterback. I think we've gotten to see him some. He's looked good. He's not been perfect, which I don't think anyone's expected him to be so. And I think that was sort of a point Kirby was making there. But what do you make of what Kirby had to say there, Ben? And just, kind of bigger picture, just what we have heard and seen from Carson to this point in camp.
Well, the number one thing that I take away from what Kirby said there is that Carson Beck is just not ever going to be the rah quarterback. So if that's what anyone's looking for, I think Kirby's very careful with his word choice when he's when he hears assertive, he's very particular about what he is assertive in doing. And he's never going to be the guy that's going to stand at the front of the room and tell people exactly, how they should be doing things or anything like that. Like, he is going to go about his business the right way. He is going to make good decisions. I think that when you talk about him taking the next step this year, I think that it is making the right decisions at a higher percentage rate than he did last season, because I think that if he does that, Georgia's going to be successful. And that's not a knock on what he did last season. I just think year over year, more experience, more, film room, everything, he's more likely to, be successful play over play. I think that, to me, the reason we're probably not hearing a whole lot about Carson Beck this fall camp is because it's a weird situation for Georgia where they really knew who the quarterback was going to be last season, and there were just no questions asked, no doubts whatsoever who the quarterback was going to be this season. And so because of that, so much of the focus has been placed elsewhere. To Kipp's point, what does the offensive line look like if Jared Wilson's not able to be healthy? To what I was talking about, what does the defensive back room look like with a lot of new faces, both at star and at safety? Or even what are the cornerbacks? Who's getting the start at cornerback? We're hearing all this stuff about the running back room, but who's it going to be? What's the what's the workload going to be? Who all is going to be able to get involved? There's so much that I think there is to focus on with this team, that because of that, the guy that everybody's known is going to be the starter for 2 seasons in a row. There's just not a whole lot to talk about, because he might have a bad scrimmage here or there. He might have a bad rep here where he throws a stupid interception or whatever that might be. All the normal things that happen in fall camp. But until Georgia's playing Clemson and he's executing, 85% of his plays or whatever it is that people would need to see from him to feel like he had a successful outing against Clemson, until people see that, there's no way to really gauge how he's upgraded year over year.
Yeah, he's kind of that known commodity really on this entire team. And he's not the only one, but he's definitely a big piece that everybody knows about. Kipp, what did you think about what Kirby had to say there specifically about Carson and him getting ready for this year?
Yeah, he's stressed all offseason about Carson, maybe being a more vocal leader, even though that's not really who he is, trying to make him uncomfortable so that he could have personal growth in that aspect. But I think they're going to find that from other areas. And I really think that the Oscar Delp being brought up today and talked to, you kind of see that maybe he's taken on that role. I think he's kind of stepping up, the lights coming on, and he knows he's got a chance to be the alpha in that room, in that offense this season. I think this is really setting up well for him. And I honestly think that you're going to be able to take, more off of Carson's plate offensively. If you have a guy like Oscar Delp being a leader in the locker room, a vocal leader, you got Dylan Bell really pushing to be the Z receiver of this year, which is it's a completely, or not Z, the X receiver, which is a completely different look for him. So he's got to learn to beat press That's the alpha wide receiver position. Usually those are your big Andre Johnson, Calvin Johnson, those kind of guys that are just bigger bodies and guys who could, play on the outside and might not be the fastest, but they come off the press really well. And so he's being pushed into a different, situation. And so I think for Carson, it's all about getting chemistry, knowing which guys you can trust offensively. And as you guys mentioned with the running back depth that we're, learning more and more, that I think Georgia's running back room is as close as it is to, what they're being known for, as we've seen in several years. I just think that, he's going to be able to be more comfortable knowing that he's got guys he can depend on. And probably this year, he's going to have one of the stronger run games Georgia's had in recent years. So I think for Carson, it's just, they're trying to push him, knowing that coming into year 2 as a starter, having an off season where people are, paying attention to what car you're driving, all the Heisman hype, all the accolades, he has to put pressure on his quarterback right now in fall camp and make sure that that Carson knows there's still plenty of room for growth, reminding him about that Alabama game. So I just think there's a lot of things that I think Kirby is trying to do now in fall camp, because once the season starts, it's just a completely different animal.
Take a quick break, come back, do a little bit more sharing some of the intel from fall camp, what we've learned, kind of a look around because we're nearing that halfway point and some of the bigger things that we've learned, talk some recruiting, talk about Stetson Bennett, of course, and then talk a little bit about the Olympics. So for everyone watching and listening, the plans for Tuesday sort of changed. We were hoping we were going to be coming off the practice field when we started recording. We thought we were going to get a viewing period. They changed that. There's hope that we might get it Thursday. So instead of kind of giving an update from what we saw today, I want to go back to the scrimmage that happened. We did not have a chance to watch any of that or any of the warm-ups or anything, but we talked to folks who were there. Wanted to pass along some of the stuff that we've had on the Junkyard, some of the stuff we've made sure our subscribers are up to date on. Some of the stuff that stood out to me sound like the running backs had a really good afternoon as a whole. I think we're going to talk more about those running backs here in a few minutes. Roderick Robinson sounds like he had a big play on a wheel route. Gunnar Stockton hit him on that play. Dan Jackson continues to impress at safety. I think he's a guy that a lot of us sort of saw as an afterthought going into this competition, going into fall camp, and Dan continues to make plays. Daniel Harris, who's gotten a lot of run at first-team corner, had a big interception. Sounds like if the game, if it would have happened in a game, he would have had a chance to make a house call from deep in his own area. Tate Ratledge running at center with Jared Wilson still working his way back. I think something that gets probably forgotten about, how big is it that Georgia got Micah Morris back? I looked at him as a guy that I hadn't heard anything that made me think he would go in the portal, but, that was a guy that would have made a whole lot of sense if he said, look, I'm not starting here and I'm going to make a move. But he comes back for another year, and to have him fill in with Tate playing some center, I think that was big. Nas Stackhouse sounds like he had a very productive day. That defensive line, although they lack depth, I do think that they're in a pretty good spot with Nazir and Christian Miller. And I think, there's a lot of excitement about what Christian Miller's done. Sounds like, as I mentioned earlier, Kirby wasn't happy with the energy level, wanted it up. That's definitely going to be something we keep an eye on and see what we hear out of the second scrimmage. Ben, what stood out to you about stuff you heard about this scrimmage, some of the intel we've passed along, anything that really caught your attention from that open scrimmage?
I won't spend too much time rehashing the running back stuff just because I think that we've talked about it a little bit already here, but it's definitely something that mean, Kipp said it. Georgia's known for having a certain culture and identity at running back, and I don't want to say that it's slipped away over recent years, because I think that when you look at guys like Dejon Edwards and Kenny McIntosh, like when you really look at it, they've been as productive as many of the great Georgia backs that get talked about in that conversation. I just think when you look at Trevor Etienne, Roderick Robinson, Branson Robinson, if he's able to be healthy, and I should note, I guess, Roderick Robinson, if he's able to be healthy as well. And then what we've heard about these freshmen, but specifically Nate Frazier of late, is that this running back room, I think, is as talented and I think more importantly, complementary as any Georgia running back room that's been there in a little while. And I think that they're going to be able to run the ball, but I do think that every single one of them brings something in the passing game that makes them a threat. I mean, I think Trevor Etienne and Nate Frazier as receiving backs gives them a really good shot to be involved in third down situations. I mean, if you were looking for how does Nate Frazier get involved early, I think that that's a really good opportunity for him. I think that Roderick Robinson, just on his sheer physical strength, is probably going to be called upon in a lot of pass blocking situations where they need that extra blocker from the running back spot. And then we'll see with Branson Robinson. They're like Kirby Smart's already said, he's on a pitch count, so they're probably not going to overuse him in situations where they don't need to, especially early on. But just you list out those four guys, and that's not to mention Chauncey Bowens and Dwight Phillips, who I've heard have had, in Chauncey's case, good offseason, good spring. He's probably further ahead from understanding things at Georgia than some of the other guys are. So again, I just think that the running back room, they've had a knack for big plays so far to start this August. And then, these cornerbacks, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think that they have the ability to be as a playmakers. You're talking about Julian Humphrey, you're talking about Daniel Harris, you're talking about Dalen Everett. I think that they have the ability. I think they're going to get tested. I think that, in the past, Kamari Lassiter had a tendency to just shut down his side of the field. People hesitated throwing towards Kamari Lassiter's side of the field. I think that everybody is going to get attacked at times throughout the course of this year. And I think that this team has a chance to make plays because of the ball skills that they have on the back end as much as any cornerback crew that Georgia's had in a while. And so I think looking at those three Georgia cornerbacks, I've heard, from the scrimmage, there was at least a couple of really impressive interceptions. I know, at the practice that people sat in on as well in Sanford Stadium, that Ellis Robinson had what was arguably the play of the day on an interception as well. And so I think that there's some playmaking ability there at corner that will be interesting to see how that flashes up early on as well.
Wanted to shout out that it sounded like Dalen Everett also had a very productive scrimmage, which I think is huge because they're really counting on him as now one of the older guys. And credit to him, it seems like he's done a really good job. Kipp, did anything catch your attention just from that first scrimmage, what we've heard and some of the stuff we've shared the last few days?
Well, just kind of reviewing everything, I do think that Dalen Everett is taking on that cornerback one role. I think that, that's something in the spring where we kind of thought about maybe there's going to be a quarterback competition for two starting positions. I do think Dalen Everett's locked himself in as a starter. He is making, a lot of plays on the ball now. He's really showing, his ability in coverage now. He had been trusted as a guy who's a willing tackler, but now it's all kind of coming together for him. And I think Daniel Harris, just with that length, we've talked about how it's crazy, the size and wingspan that he has at cornerback with how athletic he is. Probably a slight edge over Julian Humphrey right now, but I think that is a close to 50-50 battle still. So that's a great problem for them to have. Having a double dose of thunder or lightning at running back, I think is great for them. But also, I'm curious because I just don't see Josh Crawford rotating like Dell McGee did. I think you're going to be battling for carries, and I think it's gonna, if you're RB1 or RB2, then I think you got a chance to have double digit touches. But I do think that after that, depending on the game situations, I think they're going to kind of lock in on a rotation and try to tighten it up a little bit this season. So I'm curious to see how it goes. I know that after the Clemson game, all hands on deck. I think Trevor Etienne set up for a big year. And when they ramp up Branson Robinson to 100%, it's going to be, a battle on a week-to-week basis to try to get carries in that backfield, because I really think he's set up to be a guy that helps Georgia a lot more than we thought, he would coming into the season. Other than that, I brought up Dylan Bell. I just think his ongoing, working at that, the X wide receiver position is going to be huge for Georgia. They need someone obviously to step up there alongside Colby Young at that position. I think Oscar Delp is really coming on strong and having one of the best fall camps of anyone on the team. And he's always kind of been that guy, but, getting bigger and stronger, and having more competition in the tight end room has really helped him, really push himself this offseason. And then there's kind of a trickle up effect with the fall camp that Quintavious Johnson is having. The fact that he is getting, has been getting reps, in the two deep at that edge rusher position. I think has really been great for a guy like Damon Wilson, the older guy, Samuel Mpemba. Kirby's probably ecstatic that he's got a freshman coming in here and getting all the praise, because he's got these other guys that really need to have, step up this year and have big roles, between Gabe Harris, like I said, with Damon Wilson, and seeing the new guy come in and really get wins against the starting offensive line. They know that they're going to have to step it up if they want to get snaps at the edge position, especially with Michael Williams going to take some snaps there as well. So I think that, that's helping the older guys seeing this freshman come on in camp, because they can't just rest on their laurels and think that they're going to have snaps at position because of a lack of depth. It's not going to happen this year. They need more out of that position, but at the same time, I think the older guys see, okay, we need to take the next step in our development, because this guy came in acting like he's been in the program a couple of years already.
So you look at where we are in the month. We're getting about halfway, closing in on about 2 weeks before the Clemson game. And Georgia's going through fall camp, still got several practices left to go. But I did want to kind of do a roundtable of the biggest thing that we've learned or what's really stood out to us over the course of fall camp. And guys, I'll start, and I mentioned him a few minutes ago, give a big shout out to Dan Jackson. I think he's a guy that, coming into this, I really thought it was going to be KJ Bolden just stealing the show, and maybe not necessarily starting in that Clemson game, but really making it clear like it's just a matter of time. And Dan Jackson, I think, has done a great job of answering the call. There's other guys that are still in that competition with Ja'Cory Thomas, Jake Pope also. But I think that Dan is a guy that, I think I mentioned this, it might have been on last week's podcast. You would have understood if Dan decided he was just going to go on and do something else after last season. He comes back. I think he's an experienced guy. I think he's put his experience on display over and over. And, we're looking at a situation where he very well could be starting alongside Malachi Starks once this season starts. I'll throw it to you, Kipp. What has been your overarching takeaway from fall camp to this point? The big thing that you feel like you've learned at this point?
Well, other than the fact that they've got guys at running back that we, didn't really think that would have this big of a impression so far. Overall, I think, you haven't really heard anything about, who's winning these battles at the line of scrimmage so far. And I just think that that's when we talk about what Kirby's always worried about, and you mentioned the star position. Yeah, you're going to have a new starter there. I mean, a lot of positions you're going to have new starters at, so there's a lot of question marks. But which side of this line of scrimmage is winning more battles than they're losing? That's still kind of the something that we haven't really found out. I know that Georgia's offensive line, we talked about it, like probably the best in the country when healthy. I know that Monroe Freeling has added, gotten stronger and is probably going to be the swing tackle at worst this season. But overall, not hearing anything about them could be a good thing. I think that the defensive line so far, even with the lack of depth. I think the guys that they have right now are coming on strong, and we've heard great things at several players so far. So I think that's really encouraging when you have guys like Garrett and Christian Miller and Tyrion Ingram Dawkins so far impressing in camp. So I think just the line of scrimmage so far has been kind of quiet, but we've heard individual guys are having a strong camp, and I think that's going to be the key to how far Georgia goes this season.
Yeah, Monroe Freeland also mentioned from that scrimmage, he got some first-team reps, so that's a guy that I think could get into a rotation, much like we've seen these last few years. Ben, what would you say has stood out to you the most to this point in fall camp?
Probably, even though the depth isn't where they would love it to be, I think that you can see why Georgia brought in Colby Young and London Humphreys at receiver in the portal. I think those are two guys that have had really impressive fall camps, and I think that they've shown their big play ability in different ways. Like they find ways to make big plays, both of them, but they do it a little bit differently. I think that they've also both shown and probably given Georgia a little bit of confidence when it comes to taking transfer portal guys as well, because they've seen it now with Dom Lovett too in that room, that you can come in and if you go about your business the right way, you can be an immediate impact guy at the wide receiver position. And I think that Colby Young and London Humphreys have both proven that they've been there, done that at their respective first stops, and so that they're not freshmen coming into a system. I mean, they are handling this like pros, and I think they're at different points in their football journey. Like I think Colby Young would love for this to be a one and done big time year, highest draft pick possible. London Humphreys obviously has a lot more of eligibility remaining, but those are two guys that I think are going to. Colby Young, I think, goes without saying. I think that name's been brought up a bunch already, as Georgia needs him to be an immediate impact guy. And I'm not saying they need him to be wide receiver one, but if he can assume that role, Georgia's going to be in a really good spot. And I think that London Humphreys probably hasn't gotten mentioned as much since the spring, but he's someone that I definitely think is going to have to find a way to get on the field in some capacity. And so my biggest takeaway is that as much as we might raise depth concerns previously throughout the course of this episode, and I think Kirby Smart mentioned this too, it's like he thinks about depth issues, but when he calls around the rest of the country, everybody's dealing with this. And if he's looking at it fairly and objectively, Georgia's probably in a better spot depth-wise than 99% of programs and 99% of position groups. And so because of that, I think that there's we're at the time in August where the panic button gets hit just because nobody else knows what to do. And in reality, it's just part of the fall camp grind.
We're also at the time in August when you have people in the comments fighting over Mike Bobo. We are so back, boys. Wanted to make sure and point out, too, that I'll have a VIP story on Wednesday, sort of recapping sort of what we just talked about. But my big takeaways, the things I feel like I've learned to about the halfway point in fall camp. So looking forward to writing that one. Well, boys, it's been busy on the recruiting trail for Georgia, as we often expect. Saturday, good news for Georgia. 4-star cornerback Jontae Gilbert commits to the Bulldogs over NC State and Georgia Tech. Douglas product out of Atlanta, 6'1", 185. It seems like, Ben, not that long ago that we had questions about where Georgia was going with its defensive backs in 2025. But a lot has happened since then, and the latest addition is Jontae Gilbert. Tell us about what you know about this recruitment and what Georgia's getting in Jontae Gilbert.
Well, he's someone that earned his way to being in Georgia's recruiting class, and there's plenty of examples that we can point to of guys that Georgia was aware of, guys that Georgia had recruited, but Georgia just wanted to see a little bit more from them, whether that be in some cases junior or senior film, in some cases getting in person for a personal workout. In Jontae Gilbert's case, it was the latter. He went on that May 31st visit where Georgia hosted a lot of people to camp and work out. He ran a 40-yard dash at 4.51. He showed some impressive coverage skills, and I think if there's one thing that there's never been any question whatsoever about with Jontae Gilbert, it is how he's wired. and just his approach to everything. I mean, he's someone you want in your locker room. He's someone that's going to work. I mean, you talk to high school football coaches all the time when you're in a role like this, and you hear different stories, good and bad, and things people are willing to say on the record and things that they're not willing to say on the record or whatever. And it was remarkable to me to hear that in his 4 years at Douglas, or going into his freshman year through to now, he's never missed a single Douglas high school football practice. And for someone that's getting recruited at the level that he is and having to take visits at certain times of the year where it's inconvenient, he's someone that always makes it work. So Jontae Gilbert showing up is never any concern that anyone had. And so I think when he was given the opportunity by Georgia to say, hey, we want you to come compete for this spot, we want you to come prove to us why you have the green light to commit, he jumped on that immediately. And I think that really from May 31st on, it was going to be really hard for Georgia to lose this recruitment, because I think they saw enough from Jontae that day to say they cannot slow play him, or whatever word terminology you might use. You can't do that anymore. He's too good of a player right in your backyard, and he's come into your building and proven what he can do. And so I think from that moment forward, Kirby Smart took a hands-on approach in that recruitment. Dante Williams already had the pre-existing relationship with him dating back to his days at USC. And I think that really helped out as well, because I don't think that Dante Williams ever wavered in how badly he wanted Jontae Gilbert. I think that he communicated that to him when he came over from USC. And sometimes, there's a lot of voices in the room, and you have to really sell your guys that you want and that you want to stand on the table for. And I think that he's, 6'1.5", 185-pound cornerback. He has the ability to probably play any spot in that defensive backfield, but because of what he ran and what he showed at that private workout with Georgia, I think that he's going to get the chance to start out as a cover corner and see where it goes. But corner, nickel, safety, it really doesn't matter. I don't think he's going to be someone that has the ability to be a contributor. And I think he's the perfect example of an in-state guy that Georgia knew it wanted from the beginning, but you always are sitting there saying, all right, how can we go find a 5-star guy in California or Louisiana or wherever that might be? And you get caught up sometimes in these big picture recruitments. And we've seen them already sometimes this cycle with guys like Dijon Lee and DJ Pickett and other big time, high profile recruitments. And sometimes I think once you get somebody on campus and you realize what they're really about, and not that he hadn't been on campus, but I think actually getting to work with them on the practice field, it changes your whole perspective of who they are and what they can bring to your roster. And so he came to Georgia for that end of July cookout. I think that was pretty much tipping his hand, saying, hey, and by that point, he was pretty much already locked in with Georgia. It was just a matter of him getting to his August 10th commitment date. So big pickup. And again, I wrote about this earlier today, Dawgs 24/7. So go check this out in more detail. But 7 commitments for Georgia defensive backs coaches this summer. There was some questions earlier on in the cycle. How is Georgia faring with Will Muschamp and Fran Brown not on the staff anymore? Have no fear. They've gotten 7 commitments across the 25 and 26 classes since the beginning of June. And so, I think that Dante Williams and Travaris Robinson have proven why they were the ones chosen to backfill 2 really, really great recruiters in Muschamp and Fran Brown.
Kipp, sort of on that note, what do you think of the job that Georgia's DB coaches have done? It feels like maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, there were a lot of people going, what exactly is Georgia going to do at defensive back? But obviously that they've had a plan, and the latest addition, another strong one, is Jontae Gilbert.
Yeah, defensive back at Georgia has always been kind of a testing number, measurables type position. It's where, they want to know that you're athletic, but also physical enough to play the position, because it's just, they ask you to do different things at Georgia. You got to play a lot of man press. They will put you on an island out there. And so you have to be able to be physical at the point of attack, but you have to be athletic enough to where you can handle being in trail coverage and not get, 5-6 yards of separation between you and your receiver within 10-15 yards. So with, this class, I think in-person evals are just paramount. Getting these guys in and seeing them in person is really important, especially for 2 new coaches. They are, trying to establish their own position board. And so credit to these guys for working quickly in the spring. I think, they made the most of their time. They got this board set up, and now they got, 5 guys on board that they can use however they want to. I mean, from top to bottom, from Shamari Earls, Jalen Morgan. This is a group that's as versatile as it gets. Every one of these guys is a 4-star in 24/7 Sports. So it's not like they just, found some random guys. These aren't like sleepers. Okay. These are all blue chip guys. And I just think, especially with Jontae Gilbert, what a neat off the floor recruitment he had, from being committed to Ohio State to now you're working out multiple times for Georgia so that you get the green light there. I think it fits perfectly for what they're trying to do. And Kirby's brought it up. I mean, especially in this, the portal era, in state, this has kind of an added bonus to where these guys might be motivated to show out for the home state, but they're also just not going to get homesick. So you look at this group of 22 guys and you have 13 in-state guys. They're checking off that box. And I really love Jontae Gilbert just for the fact that how physical he is. I mean, Ben brought up him not missing practice. It's a hell of a combination to have a guy his size be able to be that physical on a daily basis. It shows up on film. He's an outstanding guy at the point of attack, which is exactly what Georgia loves. He can jam. If he sticks at cornerback, he's going to be able to reroute guys. But also, if he moves to safety or start, he's going to be a guy who can excel in coverage at those positions because he has the size for it. He'll be physical. He's got, the ability to play the run really well. And I think the other side, the question mark with him was that top end speed because you saw the sophomore track times, it's high 11s. And you saw the junior track times. So now you're in the mid 11s. So at this point, Georgia worked him out and they felt good about it. So maybe he's a sub 11 guy now. He's made strides in that area. And I just think that shows that Georgia knows that he can start out at corner. He can also help them in other positions. And I think that's just what this DB class looks like from top to bottom is guys that are close to 6 foot, if not well over 6 foot. Guys that are already 180 pounds, 180 to 200 pounds, they can come right in and probably help out on the 2 deep from day one.
Georgia's now got 22 commits and have the number 4 class nationally. And a big reason why is what happened on Sunday night with Christian Garrett decommitting from the Bulldogs, local product from Prince Avenue Christian, 6'4", 285. Ben, this was a situation where we were kind of caught off guard when Christian Garrett committed to Georgia. It seemed like things were trending in the right direction, but he sort of sped this up, and now he decommits. So just tell us your read of this situation and what you make of Christian Garrett's decision.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I like to think we're not caught off guard very often at Dawgs 24/7, but I will say on the way into the class and the way out of the class, I felt like Christian Garrett's timing of things surprised a little bit. And so, like you mentioned, he committed after his official visit at the beginning of June. It was that second weekend of June, and he had a commitment date scheduled for July 20th originally. And so when he committed coming out of that June 7th to 9th official visit weekend, he hadn't even left campus that Sunday when he announced his commitment. It was a little bit surprising, the timing of it. I don't think the fact that he had ended up in Georgia's class by the end of June was hugely surprising, but the fact that he had it all or that he did it then, I think was. And then on the flip side of that, on Sunday night, just when you think there might be a little bit of downtime and it's going to be fall camp focus, sure enough, Georgia decommitment happens on Sunday night. And I'll admit, it's not one that I was expecting to happen. I think that when you start to assess the situation with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, things start to make sense a little bit more. I mean, Georgia is clearly pushing heavily for 2 5-star defensive linemen in the state of Georgia. And so because of that, a lot of recruiting focus and efforts have been pointed in that direction. Meanwhile, there are other programs like Georgia Tech, like Tennessee, like Stanford. I'm sure there's probably some other programs that have given him some calls in the last 48 hours or so since he decommitted as well. But because some other programs were probably prioritizing him as much or arguably more, which might have led to the decommitment, that is not a huge surprise, just knowing how much importance has been placed on Justice Terry and Elijah Griffin this recruiting cycle. And so I'm sure that's a line of communication that's going to be kept open. Christian Garrett can get to Georgia's campus just about whenever he wants. I will note he was one of the only commitments in the class that wasn't at the end of July cookout, which I don't want to read too much into those things at the time that they happen, but then after the fact and you see this play out this way, it does make you realize like maybe something had, been going on prior to his decommitment that had led to that happening. All that to say, if he ends up in Georgia Tech's class, which right now it sounds like Georgia Tech is maybe the front runner to get him, this has been one of the better recruiting jobs that Georgia Tech's done. I know this is a Georgia podcast with a bunch of Georgia people listening that don't want to hear that Georgia Tech even knows what football is, let alone that they're having progress with it. But I think when you look at their recruiting class this cycle, there's a lot of guys from the state of Georgia that I feel like are really good football players. Rashawn Dinkins from Warner Robins. You've got Sam Turner from Southwest DeKalb. You've got Damola Ajitahan, who just committed from Duluth over Georgia recently. You've got Josh Petty, their first 5-star in the modern recruiting era, that just committed recently. If they add a guy like Christian Garrett that was previously in Georgia's class as well, I mean, it's hard to argue to me that Brent Key and what they're doing this cycle isn't better than what they've done in just about any other recruiting cycle that you could think of. But again, that hasn't played out yet, and I think that Georgia will keep that communication open. I think that it goes without saying that Justice Terry and Elijah Griffin are going to be priority 1 and priority 1A when it comes to everything else that plays out at defensive line. But Georgia has offered a couple of other guys, most recently Rutgers commit Braxton Kyle from North Gwinnett. So they'd like to add 5 defensive linemen in this cycle. Christian Garrett, Kevin Wynn were a couple of in-state guys that were higher up on the board than most, but wouldn't shock me if with some good senior film, a few other names emerge.
Yeah, Ben hit on something that I wrote about on Tuesday. Georgia Tech's got the number 20 class in the nation right now, and I could not tell you the last time they've done that. I think it's kind of good maybe to reignite this rivalry a little bit. I don't think, as someone who grew up following Georgia in the 2000s, 2010s, that rivalry hasn't had what it had in the 90s and even going farther back. So we don't know yet what Christian Garrett's going to do. But if he goes to Tech, that's going to add a little something to that rivalry, no doubt. Kipp, what do you make of Christian Garrett decommitting? Any reason for panic? Just your read on the situation.
I think the Georgia coaching staff is probably ecstatic for Christian Garrett. I mean, they love to have him on the team. But they also know that, I mean, these guys want to have an opportunity to play as early as possible. And if you have that situation come up, I don't think that they're really going to, get in the way of that, knowing that they're in good shape for a pair of, 5-star defensive linemen. So I think it's a good situation overall for both. Georgia does want another defensive lineman in this class. And I think that's going to kind of become the theme toward the end of the cycle is you start looking to see Kirby Smart usually flips a couple of guys a cycle. If he's going to flip anyone toward, the rest of this cycle, it's probably going to be a Florida State commitment. And I think that Kevin Wynn will be a guy that Georgia continues to recruit and focus on and try to get back on campus, just like CJ Wiley at the wide receiver position. I think those are the guys that they're going to save spots for regardless in this cycle, and then continue to evaluate senior film, but also know that, again, the transfer portal is right around the corner. So as we start to look at how Georgia's going to handle remaining spots, knowing that not really sure how the 105 roster situation is going to affect this signing class, if at all. I think overall, when you're specifically looking at the defensive line, and Georgia feels pretty good about a pair of 5-stars already in Justice Terry and Elijah Griffin, and now they can kind of focus on a guy like Kevin Wynn and see the other offers they've extended. They can continue to evaluate these guys, knowing that most of them aren't really in a rush to make any decisions anytime soon.
Be sure to stay glued to Dawgs 24/7. Ben and Kipp and all of us will have updates on everything going on and all the latest recruiting news. Well, guys, let's give a shout out to Stetson Bennett. Stetson had, I think, fair to say, an up and down Sunday. Basically, his return to the Rams, first time he's been in a preseason game since last season. 24 of 38, 224 yards, 1 touchdown, 4 interceptions. Not the ideal game, but that touchdown was the game winner late. I think there was like 10 seconds left in the game. The Rams beat the Cowboys 13-12. I'll start with you, Kipp. Would you make a Stetson, again, not how he would have drawn it up, but finding a way to help his team get the W?
Well, I posted on the Junkyard immediately when he came down there and had his first completion, just how, great it was to see Stetson Bennett playing football again. I mean, our lives are all better whenever we're able to see somebody playing the game that they love and looking like he's, having fun out there. It is huge. I mean, that's a big step for him. And obviously I couldn't have seen what happened after that coming, but that was the point. He's back out there playing football again. And honestly, you take the good with the bad. The first couple of interceptions were, that's just part of what you sign up for with Stetson. I mean, he's a gunslinger. I think the really important part for him was that he was still running the offense. He even said it. He's like, you're either going to score or you're going to give the ball away every possession. And that's what he was trying to do every time. And, he got them in position, every single drive. He got them, close to the red zone, if not in the red zone. I think like every one of these drives, there weren't 3 and outs. It was like 14 plays, 12 plays, 6, 8 plays. And then again, after throwing what really could have been 5 interceptions, if not the last one being called back, for them to have a 13-play, 3-minute drive to get them to the end zone at the end. I mean, that's adversity. That's it right there. So if you're Sean McVay, you know that you have a lot to work on as far as decision-making, as far as how he's layering the football. But at the same time, like the fact that he is controlling that huddle every single drive, putting them in the right plays, you can fix the other stuff. So what Stetson showed out there showed again that he was a guy that should have been drafted. He's a guy that has NFL talent, has an NFL arm, and just has to be able to see the field better. And so that was really encouraging just to see him out there, knowing that he's going to probably be the backup quarterback at least, the first couple of games of the season. So we have an opportunity to see Stetson Bennett play in an NFL regular season game this fall. We got a preview of that, and I mean, it was entertaining, if anything.
Yeah, Jimmy Garoppolo will be suspended for the first 2 games, so that kind of is a prime spot for Stetson going into the regular season. Ben, what'd you think of the mailman coming through again and ending that thing on a high note?
Well, I hadn't really looked into the stat line until you read it out. I mean, 38 pass attempts, 1 touchdown, 4 interceptions. That sounds like one of my EA college football 25 stat lines right there. It also shows to me that the Rams want to figure out what they've got in Stetson, and they want to throw everything at him, because the fact that they're giving him 38 pass attempts in a preseason game that he's throwing 4 interceptions, I mean, they want to believe in him and they see something in him. And I think we're familiar with the Stetson Bennett experience. I mean, this game encapsulated the Stetson Bennett experience. Like, it doesn't always look pretty. If you just listened to talking heads give their back and forth throughout every moment of Stetson Bennett's preseason game, you were going to get a lot of opinions that were going to differ over the course of that game. And then when it was all said and done, he won the game on a 4th down conversion when it had to be done. And that's kind of what the Stetson Bennett experience has always been. I mean, Kipp brought it up. He created that thread right after the first completion, and then just to track the things that people had to say on the Junkyard from that moment forward was hilarious, given the material that he provided them during the course of the game and then how it ultimately ended. And so, yeah, I mean, it was fun to watch. There were a couple of people that were taken on our board that were taking the sort of snooty. It was a preseason game. He threw 4 picks, approach, whatever. I mean, I'm in the camp of treasure these moments when you can. You don't know how many times you're going to get to watch Stetson Bennett make 4th down touchdown throws in professional football games. So enjoy them while you can. And that was certainly a fun one to watch in his return to the NFL.
Yeah, Ben, like you said, I mean, the Rams saw something in him going back to the draft. I mean, he was a 4th-round pick, and I don't think any of us thought he'd go quite that high. And my thing to what you just said, shout out to Stetson for being back. I mean, I'll be completely honest. After him stepping away last year, I wondered if he would ever play again. If his career could be coming to a close before really his first regular season. So shout out to Stetson for bouncing back from that. Obviously, we'll all be watching the rest of this preseason. And like Kipp said, you never know. These early games or maybe a situation where Stetson gets put into the game. Matthew Stafford is not a spring chicken. He's been around for a while. So when you think about ideal situations for Stetson to be in, feels like a pretty good spot to be with the Rams right now. Well, before we close out, let's talk a little bit about the Dawgs who were out in Paris for the Olympics. Georgia athletes brought home 6 medals. Going to run through real quick. Anthony Edwards helps the U.S. men's basketball team get gold. Double figures in 4 straight games. Great performances from Anthony Edwards. Nick Fink, a gold in the 4x100 medley. Also had 2 silvers. Quay Bethune with the women's soccer team that she helped them win their first gold medal. And then Aaliyah Butler, who was part of the 4x400 relay team that brought home gold. Dawgs definitely represented themselves well. Ben, did you have a favorite moment? Not necessarily Georgia specific, but from the Paris Olympics, something that you think will stick with you, something you enjoyed watching?
Well, I will say I think it is Georgia specific. I think watching Steph Curry hit those shots on 4 straight possessions, Anthony Edwards was sitting on the sideline there with the biggest cheese and smile on his face that you could ever imagine. I think that a Georgia guy getting the front row seat in Paris with the personality that he has, getting to watch that basketball moment. I don't know how many people watching this got a chance to be watching that in the moment, but that was fun for me to watch, and I guess Anthony Edwards seemed to be having as much fun as anyone watching it as well. I will also say it's going to be tough for LA to beat some of the scenes, I feel like, or the venues at least. Like the beach volleyball happening at the Eiffel Tower. I don't know that there's a better venue in sports for any sport that's ever taken place ever than beach volleyball getting played right at the Eiffel Tower. So tough for LA to top, but I'm sure that being America as it is, that we will try and find a way to do it if we can.
I don't think this was in the gold medal game, but I think at one point Anthony Edwards during a game was just yelling USA, USA at one of the other players. So that was definitely up there for me. Kipp, what about you just from the entire Olympics? Anything really catch your attention? Something you think will stick with you?
I just think it was really entertaining. The track and field events, just watching USA have an outstanding performance, but just a lot of drama, between Noah Lyles, relay teams. It seemed like you had guys coming from behind in multiple races. It was really entertaining. And also, just to tack on, Anthony Edwards had a blast, and it's just, his future is so bright right now. He was out there with, this was kind of that maybe the last games for a lot of the NBA's legends. And for him to have that experience with them, and you could tell with Steph Curry, he is well respected among those guys. Steph had him next to him in almost every, live video. Every time he'd go to social media, he had an ant behind him just, acting up or trying to tell a story. So you could tell that they know that he is the future face of this league. And he might walk away with several Olympic medals when all is said and done. But honestly, I'm excited for the Los Angeles Olympics because, we get to have flag football. That's going to be really exciting. And the fact that, we didn't have baseball and softball. I get that, I don't think France is going to be real big into having that. You want to be able to juice your stats, which they did. They got that home advantage and had their best Olympic performance since I think 1900. But we had just seen, the emergence of baseball and softball in the Olympics, and then to have them not be in the Olympics this time was, kind of disappointing. So I'm excited just to see those sports return and to know that we should probably have pretty good performances from the United teams. But we've seen that in the World Baseball Championships. I think it's the competition level in that sport is it's a lot more than people think. I think that seeing different countries compete for that really showed that that's an untapped area of competition, and just having, Major League Baseball players representing their countries is just really fun. So I'm pumped to see that in LA.
Two things for me: Simone Biles, the GOAT. I mean, what a great Olympics, and for her to still be doing it, just absolutely outstanding. So cool to see that. And then Noah Lyles in that 100-meter. I cannot believe how close that was. I really won't, guys. I don't know if you've ever seen. It's kind of a meme where it's the guy running suicides and he doesn't quite hit the line. It's like the difference between winning and losing. I really want, that poster, just how close it was, for that to kind of take over. But what a great Olympics. It was so much fun to follow that every single day. And especially, it's nice with our jobs. We'll be sitting at home working through stories in an afternoon. Just kind of had that on in the background. It was definitely a very fun experience. Well, we will wrap up the episode right there. Appreciate everyone who watched this live, everyone who was watching or listening to this after the fact. Be sure to go subscribe to Dawgs247.com. We are about midway through fall camp, so still a lot of good intel coming in the next few days, and a lot to get into in preparing for the start of another season. Go to Dawgs247 on YouTube. We've got all these podcast episodes, Kirby Smart press conferences, interviews with players, and those will continue going forward. And also go to TikTok, where we are on Dawgs247, have a lot of content from these episodes, the interviews, and also just some stand-up stuff, some cool stuff we got going on there. So for Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care.